Okay. Hi, Angie. How are you?
Hi, Doug. I'm fine. How are
Thank
you?
you. I'm doing well. Thank you for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me.
So, is your primary job, career, a caregiver or an author?
That's a good question. I actually spent 40 years in elder adult services, all aspects, pretty much home care, independent housing, assisted living, and nursing homes. Um, so, started as a recreation therapist and then moved on, although we were called activities directors back then, it was a long time ago. And then I went on to become an executive with a large not-for-profit. Um, and so I helped develop dementia care training programs and educated staff on dementia care, and uh, also did a number of other
Okay.
aspects.
So you did that for 40 years? Are you
Yes, I
still
did.
doing it or did you retire?
I retired. And following my retirement, I started working more as a volunteer and learned that there aren't that many resources for family members who are trying to care for a loved one in their own home, or care for a loved one who lives across the country. Um, that there isn't the training, there isn't the information for individual family members. So that's the reason for the book.
Okay, great. Is this your first book?
It is. It is my first.
Oh, all right. And when did it come out?
It came out in July.
In July. Okay.
Yeah.
How's it doing so far?
Well, I guess it's doing pretty well. I mean, it's not a hot genre, you understand. It's not going to make the top 100 books, but in its area, it's doing quite well.
I did want to ask you a bit about dementia because it's something that I think all of us may have to deal with at some point with aging parents, grandparents, and perhaps even ourselves at some point. The one thing that I've never quite figured out how to deal with is people that have dementia or are showing signs of dementia typically don't accept the fact that they have it. And how do you convince somebody that, you're maybe not as sharp as you used to be? And people don't like to admit that. I know I saw issues with my grandmother years ago where she would start doing some strange things. I don't know if you don't mind. I'll just give you a quick example, and then you can add into it. But my father died very young. He was only 50 years old when he died, and he died of cancer. And my grandparents, his parents, outlived him by almost 20 years. After he died, she went into sort of mental decline from the loss of her child. And, she would do things like wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and start cooking a full meal. And my grandfather would come down the stairs and say, honey, what are you doing? And she said, oh, I'm cooking for Jimmy. He's hungry, which was my father who had died years ago. So she started having hallucinations and she started doing things like that. And it just kind of got worse until she finally passed away. Then she wouldn't remember. In other words, the next morning, she wouldn't remember waking up at all to cook. She said, what are you talking about, right? How do you deal with somebody like that? What is the best approach? Because it could be real frustrating.
Well, it is very frustrating, and I think the reason why people won't admit to this, there's two reasons why. It's terrifying. People think that they're being told they're going crazy, and we're not very good at handling any kind of mental disruption in this country. It's amazing that your liver could be diseased and everyone would understand that. Your heart can be diseased and everyone understands
Right.
that. Dementia is a disease of the brain. And the brain is just an organ. It's just another organ in our body, and it can fail. But we believe that our brain is where we live, right? That's where your personality is, right? It's up here. But if you've ever had a child, you know that that's not true. People are people, regardless of what's happening to their brain. We have hearts, we have spirits, there are emotions. So part of the problem is teasing those things apart and helping people understand they don't have to feel shame. So it's shame and fear. Shame and fear, when I'm ashamed and afraid of what you're telling me, it makes me angry. So I'm going to push back on it. I mean, psychologists will tell you that fear and shame are the two primary reasons for anger and angry responses. So it's very difficult to talk to people about the fact that their brain isn't functioning the way that it should. And sometimes it's dementia, and other times, quite honestly, all of our body systems start to show wear as we get older. We can be very vibrant and contribute into our 100s, but just like an old piece of furniture, we start to show wear. So how to have that conversation with people is to be as non-threatening as possible, and talk simply about what that person is doing is affecting you, and how can we work through this. It's a very difficult conversation to have. Taking away the car keys is another thing that has to happen. And it happens all the time. One of the most common problems is, how do I tell mom she can't drive? And the answer often is to involve another professional as well. There are memory care clinics that can give tests, simple tests that 30-question tests that really give you a clear view of what's going on in the brain. And with your grandmother, it sounds like memory loss wasn't the biggest and first symptom necessarily. She was more confused and had some day-night inversion going on. So that's the kind of symptoms of dementia that a memory care clinic might be able to help, and have someone who's professional explain what's going on to someone like your grandmother. But I can't pretend that those aren't extremely difficult conversations to have, and perhaps your grandfather was not the right messenger.
Well, in the end, it was interesting because I guess she did that a couple of times. And I guess his solution to that was he told her, look, why don't you stay in bed and I'll go and cook for Jimmy. And that stopped it. So, that was sort of smart, I think, for him.
And he probably didn't cook, right? He didn't.
Oh, no, he
so
didn't.
That's what we call a therapeutic fib.
Right. Yeah. That's what he did. But it kept her in bed. It kept her from cooking. And I think he was just worried that she was going to light the house on fire, because maybe she would go down and turn the stove and the oven on and then forget all about it. Mm-hmm. So anyways, it didn't happen anymore after that. But, she was never diagnosed with anything. So I don't know if he just didn't take her to the doctors, or, she wasn't diagnosed with anything in particular. And one day her day came, and that was it, So I don't know, maybe it was generational. Maybe they just didn't feel like they wanted to involve doctors in something like that. I don't know.
Well, a lot of doctors aren't very well versed, especially general practitioners, internists aren't terribly well versed. I'm sorry if there's any of you listening who are, because you will disagree with me, but a lot of training, especially older doctors, it wasn't part of the medical training that people received. And it's hard news to deliver. So doctors don't like giving patients bad news. And sometimes the signs are really subtle. And it's, if you told a doctor she is up in the middle of the night cooking, the doctor might say, well, perhaps she had a dream. Doctors aren't always very good at coming up with diagnoses unless you have to honestly present the symptoms. And the problem is, and you identified it here, that the person with dementia may not be able to present the symptoms because they won't acknowledge them. So then someone else has to talk to the doctor.
Mental illness is something that is a whole different animal then. And it's interesting that you said, the brain is just another organ in the body. And that's true. But mental illness is a whole different animal than a broken leg, isn't it? And how advanced are we? Or how have we developed or evolved in terms of treating mental illness? Because I know that during the 80s, a lot of the antipsychotic drugs came out, and they started putting people on these drugs, and some people got better. Some people could function fairly normally. Now we have what seems to be a big epidemic of mentally ill people living on the streets and homelessness. So I know that during the 80s, they closed a lot of what they used to call psychiatric facilities. What is going on with the mental illness treatments in the United States at this point?
Well, that's a very big area, and my expertise is relatively confined to dementia. But I will say that there are a lot of elderly people living on the streets as well, and
that's sad.
and that dementia can strike as young as in the 40s. And I have a friend who was diagnosed in her 40s, so it can strike fairly early. And as far as we're trying, right? But we still don't like to acknowledge mental illness. There are medications that help some cases of mental illness. But for instance, there's a dementia called Lewy body disease, which appears like psychosis and hallucinations. Your grandmother, it makes me think of this. Hallucinations, 80% of those with Lewy body disease experience hallucinations. And antipsychotic drugs exacerbate the symptoms. So they're contraindicated. So it's really important for neurologists to be involved, or geriatric clinicians like geriatric psychiatrists, geriatric psychologists, to be involved when an elderly person starts having hallucinations and those kinds of symptoms. And it didn't last long for your grandma, but these are very difficult situations. And the typical drug regimen for a psychosis is not going to work. So I would say we're still in the dark ages when it comes to dealing with mental illness. And I
would agree with you. Yeah. Last question, and we do have to wrap it up. Unfortunately, our time is kind of blown by. Is there any drugs available for dementia at this point?
Well, there are a couple of drugs that are shown to slow the symptoms. And they will slow the progress of the disease. They will not stop the progress of the disease. But sometimes a person, if they slow the progress, they can outlive the disease. If that makes sense, they can die of something else before they experience very serious symptoms. So those drugs are available through any physician, and they're used to prescribing them. Aricept is one of them. So they do have side effects like any other medication. The primary thing that people can do if they want to avoid mental illness, dementia, is exercise. Physical exercise has been shown to be the largest preventative. So if you have someone with mild to moderate dementia, or a precursor of that, which is called mild cognitive impairment, the best thing they can do is get regular aerobic exercise. And also try to learn new things, do new things, get outdoors, get a pet, garden. There are just a number of ways that you can help your brain build up excess reserve synapses so that if dementia does occur, you have a cognitive reserve to call on.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Wow. Okay. Well, great information. Angie, thank you so much for coming on. We do have to wrap this up. Your book is called I Know You by Heart, Navigating the Dementia Journey.
Correct.
Do you have a website that you want to give out?
I do have a website. It's dementiaheart.com.
Great. Okay. Thanks again for coming on. This was very informative.